Here's a common experience. Have you ever said something in a meeting only to have it ignored, and then a man gets credit when he says just about the same thing 2 minutes later? And then have you ever wondered, boy, I must be a terrible communicator? This happens a lot, and it reflects one of the 4 patterns of bias working women need to know. The good news is that this video will teach you how to spot each one of these patterns and will provide strategies to help you navigate through each one. When my daughter Rachel was born, I thought, whoa, the work world is just not set up for motherhood. And so I began to study the barriers that mothers face and the bias that often produces those barriers. And as a result, I began to read study after study of bias at work. And that whole experience had a huge effect on me because those studies, they resonated with me. And so what I did is took hundreds of those studies and organized them into 4 basic patterns. And then I interviewed 127 very successful women and just described the patterns and very simply asked, hey, any of that sound familiar? Every syllable, said one woman. Another woman said, you just described my life. 96% of the women I interviewed had encountered one or more of these patterns. So I began to give a talk called The 4 Patterns of Gender Bias, and as soon as I described them, people recognized them immediately. They began to laugh, they began to nudge each other. But the problem is, I described the 4 patterns, but I left them hanging with those patterns. So what I did is I sought out women who had clearly navigated their careers in a very successful way, and I asked them, can you share your strategies? What's worked for you? Up to now, every woman has had to figure all this out by herself. But now I've compiled all the strategies in a book. It's called What Works for Women at Work. And I decided to write it with my daughter, Rachel Dempsey, because it's really important that these conversations be cross-generational. Our aim is to provide a full palette of strategies from low risk to true moxie. Because people are different and they find themselves in different situations, so one size does not fit all. Let me tell you what the 4 patterns of bias are. The first is prove it again. The second, the tightrope. Third, the maternal wall. And the 4th, tug of war.
Working on this project, we found that prove it again bias was one pattern that women face starting very early in their careers.
Because most people in high-level jobs are men, women sometimes just don't seem quite as good a fit. So often they have to provide more evidence of competence than men in order to be seen as equally competent. They literally have to prove themselves sometimes over and over again. This plays out in a number of different ways. One is men are often judged on their potential, women on their achievements. Also, women's mistakes tend to be noticed more and remembered longer. But women's successes tend to be attributed to luck. It's called he's skilled, she's lucky.
Since prove it again means that people are more likely to notice your mistakes and overlook your successes, it's really important to draw attention to your accomplishments. One great strategy for this is what we call the posse. Find a group of people you like and admire and praise their successes publicly and have them praise yours.
Another reason the posse is so super effective is that often other people can celebrate your successes in a way that you can't. Because women are supposed to be modest, so sometimes people feel uncomfortable if women aren't. What the posse allows you to do is to do something very appropriate, to celebrate someone else's successes. Meanwhile, of course, though, they're celebrating yours. The posse works because it takes traditionally feminine behavior, being selfless and communal, and uses it to soften behavior that might be seen as too masculine otherwise. This is an example of gender judo. Gender judo is the key for toning down behavior that might be seen as a little too masculine and toning up behavior that might be seen as too feminine or lacking executive presence. So, for example, if you get feedback that you lack executive presence, try making a few changes. Be a little more assertive. And two ways to do that are make direct eye contact, that's super important, and direct statements. Don't end your sentences, for example, with a question mark. Direct statements, direct eye contact. The second pattern is called the tightrope. That stems from the fact that these jobs are seen as requiring masculine qualities, but women, they're supposed to be feminine. So women often find themselves caught. If they're seen as too feminine, they're often liked but not respected. And if they're seen as a little too masculine, then they're often respected but not liked. Sometimes it can seem like a lose-lose situation.
An example of the tightrope is that women often get stuck doing the office housework. The office housework is any of the work that may be necessary to keep the office running, but isn't a part of your job description and doesn't advance your career. So for example, this could mean serving on women's or diversity committees, or remembering everyone's birthday.
But isn't that kind of stuff really important?
It is, which is why one great strategy is called the strategic no. Say yes to one or two pieces of office housework that you think are important, and then say no to the rest. But demonstrate your commitment and provide an alternative. So for example, if you're asked to serve on another committee when you already are doing two pieces of office housework, just say, I'm really invested in the mentoring program, but I think Joe down the hall would be a great addition to the diversity program. A related strategy is just to ask for help directly. Often these jobs fall to women because no one else volunteers. Don't let the work default to you. Just say something like, hey, the last time the servers crashed, I dealt with IT. Do you mind dealing with it this time?
You know, that's another example of gender judo. You're doing something very suitably feminine, mentoring committee, empathetic, communal, but you do it in a masculine tone by putting your foot down a little bit and saying, hey, you do it this time. The third pattern we call the maternal wall, and that reflects the fact that sometimes after women have children, they're seen as less competent and less committed than before. And real penalties can result, even if you haven't changed a bit. The maternal wall really stems from a catch-22. Sometimes people think if you're a good mother, maybe you're not that good a worker. On the other hand, if you're a really great worker, maybe you're not that great a mother. You know, you can counter these assumptions sometimes just by providing information. So you should be very explicit about your career goals. And for example, if you're still willing to travel, say so. If you're the primary earner, say so. If your family is willing to move, if you get a great opportunity, say that too. Because if you don't, then people might make an opposite assumption. And if you get a comment like, I don't know how you can work such long hours, my wife could never do that. You can just say very mildly, you know, different things work for different families, and this is really working well for mine. The final pattern, I call it tug of war. The fact is that women use different strategies for navigating the first three patterns. The tug of war happens when women's different strategies end up pitting them against each other.
Some women navigate a man's world by acting masculine. They're direct and assertive, or they make it clear that work is their number one priority. Other women take the strategy of being more feminine. They're generous and approachable, and good at putting people at ease. Neither of these perspectives is necessarily better. The tug of war is when the approachable women say of the assertive ones, no wonder no one wants to work with her. And the assertive women say of the approachable ones, no wonder no one takes her seriously. Instead of confronting the stereotypes that box women into these roles, it becomes another conversation about women undercutting each other.
You know, the best approach if someone is undercutting you is just to be very direct about it and make an enemy into an ally. One of the women I interviewed had a really fabulous way of doing this. She had this situation and she went to the woman in question and said, you know, have I done something to offend you? Because if I have, I really want to know so I can address it. And as the conversation developed, she really sent the message, you know, I really intend to support your career, and I hope you'll do the same for me. And that was really the underlying message that she was conveying. Before concluding, it's important to remember that what we've provided here are individual strategies, and that's different from institutional solutions. But organizational change is tricky, and it takes time. So, in the meantime, women need strategies to help them navigate what's there. In some ways, what you have to do to survive in the system can feel like exactly the opposite from what you have to do to change the system. But the fact is, if you give women effective strategies for navigating and more women survive and thrive in their careers, you'll have more women and you'll have a more diverse leadership. And that also is important for institutional change. Here's one thing we recommend people can go do tomorrow. Go out and find 3 people for a posse and consider having one of them be a man. That way, he can celebrate your successes, and you know what? You'll celebrate his. That way, no one's successes are overlooked, and you have a supportive environment for everyone.